Okay, hello everybody. So I'm going to talk through energy and ecosystems. If you can hear noise, I'm in the kitchen and it's the dishwasher or the dog or probably one of my children coming in for their 20,000th snack of the day, but I'll try and keep it quiet. Or be other things. Right, so energy and ecosystems is 5.3 on the specification list. So 5.3, if you look in your notes, if you look on the glossary, you should be able to see it. So it's this, if you see this is your glossary bit. So this is from 5.3, so these are all the terms we're going to look at. Before we get started, if you want to pause the video and have a think about all these terms, these you'll have done at GCSE and hopefully you've got some ideas. So pause and have a go. Okay, so hopefully you know what all these are. I shall go through them with you. So if we just move this along. So I'll go to that one there. The first one on the list I think was a producer. Let me just see. So we have a producer, a primary, secondary or tertiary consumer. Saprobionts isn't on this diagram. Herbivore, carnivore, omnivore and trophic level were the different terms I put on that original slide. So we'll start off with producers. If we go to this slightly simpler one, a producer is basically a plant. So a producer is an organism that can trap the sun and do photosynthesis and produce glucose. So that's our producer. That's the main way that energy enters an ecosystem. Okay. The next one I think I had was primary, secondary, tertiary consumers. So if you have a look on here, you can see primary and secondary. If I go to the other one, hopefully, yeah, you can see primary, secondary and tertiary and even quaternary consumers. So these are everything else that comes after in the food chain. A primary consumer is always a herbivore, okay? And then a secondary, tertiary and quaternary consumers are always carnivores. There are omnivores obviously as well. Usually we see omnivores at the higher levels. So an omnivore is an organism that eats both meat and veg and plants as well. So we're omnivores and dogs are omnivores and it's a big long list anyway. Okay. Let's see what else was on that list. If I just have a look on there. Saprobionts, we can't really see them on here. On the original picture, if you look at the bottom, I think you're probably used to calling them decomposers. And we need to call them saprobionts. I'll get a bit more into that later. So that is the phrase we have to use. A saprobiont is an organism that feeds on dead and decaying organic matter and is essential for the recycling of nutrients, things like nitrates, for example. Okay, so going back to those original producers, primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, saprobionts, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, and trophic level is the last one. So trophic level is the position in the food chain that these organisms take. All right, so I'll go a little bit more about that when we start looking at food chains and food webs. Let's go back a little bit though and talk about what an ecosystem actually is. So an ecosystem is an area, a community, where we have the organisms in that community and it's their interactions with their biotic and their abiotic components of an area. So the biotic components of an area we've already just met. So biotic components are the living components of an ecosystem. So if we go back to this one, these are all our biotic components of the ecosystem. Producers, consumers, whether primary, secondary or tertiary, and our decomposers. And then finally, it's the abiotic components of an ecosystem. So these are the non-living aspects. So things like water availability, oxygen availability, pH of the soil, salinity of the water or the soil. All of those things are abiotic. So this is supposed to be a rainforest ecosystem with all the plants and animals and the abiotic conditions that they have. These tend to have very complex food webs rather than food chains. And then we also have things like an aquatic ecosystem. Aquatic ecosystems are much more fragile, partly because of the Partly because of what we're doing to the planet, unfortunately, but also because you can have some quite hostile aquatic ecosystems, for instance at the poles, and they're quite fragile because they don't have very complicated food webs. They have more food chains, and therefore if one organism becomes extinct, it will endanger the entire ecosystem. Whereas if you go back to something like the rainforest, where you've got a huge variety of organisms at each trophic level, it means that they can cope with slight changes. Just before we move on with this, you might not know about certain terms. So just like in our rainforest ecosystem, the plants there are the producers. In an aquatic ecosystem, these things are the producers. These are called phytoplankton, and also algae are in there as well. So these are tiny microscopic organisms within the oceans, within the sea, that can do photosynthesis. They can trap sunlight, fix inorganic carbon dioxide, and turn it into glucose and start the whole ecosystem off. The things that feed on the phytoplankton are what we call zooplankton, which are animal versions, and they are the two starting points of an aquatic ecosystem. In fact, at certain times of the year, so this is a satellite shot of Ireland, and if you can see the beautiful sort of green appearance, I don't know if you can see just to one side on the west coast around Ireland, that is what we call an algal bloom. So that's where we have tons and tons and tons of algae and phytoplankton all reproducing and produce this lovely green colour. And that is what attracts the whales and turtles to the shores of West Island every year, so we can see them. Okay, so we've had a look at a simple food chain. So if you follow the arrows down, the arrow is supposed to show energy flow, energy from the sun, trapped by the producer, and then that does photosynthesis to produce glucose, and then that energy can flow then into the primary consumer when it eats it, and secondary consumer, and so on and so forth. Simple food chain. But the reality is, generally speaking, most ecosystems work off a food web, like so. So they are much more complicated. So for instance, heather at the beginning is our producer, and the primary consumers, the herbivores, are the rabbits, the mice, the flies, the aphids, okay, but also the ladybird. Now the ladybirds are interesting because the ladybird, if you follow the arrow from the aphid to the ladybird, and then if you follow from heather to ladybird, ladybird is a herbivore. Well, actually, is both a herbivore and a carnivore. So it's an omnivore. So a ladybird is a primary consumer and a secondary consumer because it also feeds on the aphids. So you can see some organisms actually are at different points within those trophic levels. So heather is the first trophic level. There's the producer. Oops, go away. And then we've got the next level, rabbits. That's our next trophic level, and so on and so forth. These are the saprobionts, if I spoke about these at all previously. These are bacteria or fungi that feed on dead and decaying organic matter. So they do extracellular digestion. So they not excrete, they secrete enzymes onto the matter around them. They break down those large molecules into smaller ones, they absorb them, and some of them stay in the soil as well. It's essential for the recycling of nutrients, things like nitrates, for instance. So some lovely pictures. So we see this on trees, rotting trees, fungi are bringing that about, saprobionts, like so. Okay. Now you've got a number of questions. So we've got questions like these. I've put in a little thing for you to do. So you can have a go at those ones. You can either do them now or you can do them after you've watched the whole video. It's entirely up to you. Okay, the next bit we need to talk about is something called biomass, which is biological mass. Okay, now that's the next part of the specification. So biomass is just what I've said it is. It's biological mass. So when a plant does photosynthesis, it takes that glucose, and it's got two possibilities with the glucose. and I'll come to this in another video, it can take that glucose and put it into respiration. And when it puts it into respiration, that is energy lost from that plant to the environment. However, it can take that glucose and build it together and make cellulose, or it can build it together and make starch. And this is a biological mass that makes up the tissues of the plants. These are not little things. I mean, the picture you've got in front of you is one of the, I think they're called sequoias, the great, huge redwoods that we find in different places in America. And, you know, we are talking some serious biological mass there. You know, you can see, to give you some context, the size of the human beings that are hanging off that tree trunk. Okay, so this is what comes into the plant through photosynthesis. This biological mass is what's going to feed the rest of that food chain and the rest of that food web. Okay, so we are intent as biologists to measure these kinds of things. So how we measure it, there's a few ways we can do it. One of them is calorimetry. And there's another way of measuring biomass as well. So if we talk about the other way first, I don't think I've got a picture on this, so I'll go back to that one. So biological mass is difficult to try and get an idea of biological mass. It will be measured in something like grams per unit area, okay? Grams per unit area, something like that. It's difficult to sort of get it because things like plants, their mass will vary massively because of water, because of osmosis, because when those cells take up lots of water, that will change the mass significantly. And we're not interested in water weight, we're interested in the actual biological tissue within the actual plant itself. So the way in which it's done is we would put the plant into an oven, we'd take it out, so we'd weigh it, put it into an oven, try and drive off some of the water, evaporate the water, bring it out, weigh it again. Now we still can't be sure we've driven off all the water, so you have to repeatedly do it until you get a constant mass, and that way we know we've driven off all the water and we are measuring the true biomass. Now another way, this calorimetry is to do with the sort of chemical energy stored within the plant itself rather than the mass. So calorimetry is a physics technique where you would take some of that biomass, and in the example here we've got looks like a bean. We would burn it in a sealed environment, and we would see how much energy is required to evaporate a certain volume of water and how long that would take. There's a calculation, and it would give you the amount of energy that's stored within that producer, that plant, at any given time. If you have a look in the notes, you'll be able to see. Just excuse me with me while I move screenshots about. Don't know if you can see it. Dun, dun. Oh, it's sort of cut off for you, isn't it? I don't think you can see it properly. Let's see if I can make that move. There we go. So let's get the calorimetry there. There it is. So it's there. It's in your notes. If you just excuse me. So a known mass of a sample of biomass is burnt, so all the energy is released to heat a known volume of water. The increase in temperature of the water is then used to calculate the chemical energy of the biomass. To calculate this, you need to know that 4.2 joules of energy is required to raise the temperature 1 centimetres cubed by 1 degree. Okay, right, so that is a physics technique. Don't ask me, I don't know anything about it. Okay, if we go down, this is the other biomass one that I've talked about how to estimate it. All right. Right, next bit then, let's have a look. I'll move back to the PowerPoint. Look at me, technology queen. Da-da-da. Okay, so using calorimetry, we can therefore figure out how much energy is available at each of these different trophic levels. And as you can see, the amount of energy available decreases. So before we run out of time, so you get 15 minutes on these things, and I'll just do a second video in a minute, have a think about this. Suggest ways in which energy is lost between trophic levels at all these different points. Okay, so the video is going to stop, have a think about it, but you can go straight on to video 2 and I'll carry on talking about those bits. Okay, bye.